Hello, everyone. I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for another 30-minute skills. For those of you joining for the first time, a big welcome to you. These monthly lessons are a quick and efficient way to hone your reporting skills and build on your First Amendment knowledge. So thank you for joining us. These classes are also more than that, though. They're a way for you to reconnect with a community of journalists, researchers, attorneys, and academics who regularly attend these lessons. So to everyone here today, please use the chat to introduce yourself, showcase your own work, connect with others, and provide any kind of resources or additional materials that you think is relevant to today's discussion. Also, make sure you register for our upcoming lessons. Registration links can be found at nefac.org. As a reminder, previous 30-minute skills are available at nefac.org and on our YouTube channel, 5 Freedoms. Lessons include data cleaning, privacy law, Microsoft Excel basics, and how to diversify sources, among many other topics. Today's presentation is focused on audio reporting, and it's supported in part by the estate of Gloria L. Negri. Gloria was a trailblazing journalist at the Boston Globe for more than 50 years. This program is part of her legacy of newsroom education and her lifelong commitment to local journalism. You can learn more about Gloria and other NEFAC supporters at nefac.org/supporters. During today's presentation, I again encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and share your own experiences and resources. You can also use the chat or the Q&A button to ask questions of our instructor, and we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. We have a lot to cover, not a lot of time, so let's get started. Jeff, all yours.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks to NEFAC for having me here. My name's Jeff, and let's get going. I have my clock. We'll keep it to time. If you could take away one thing from this entire presentation, it's that this is not that difficult. If I can do it, you can do it. You can do it better, maybe, than you have been doing it, or than you have expected. But I'm a newspaper reporter at heart. That's how I started, and so we'll go into that briefly just to get a sense of, if I can do that. I started in newspapers in 2001 at the Meriden Record-Journal in Meriden, Connecticut. I was at the Hartford Courant for 6.5 years or so. And telling stories for the eyes and not for the ears really was how I was trained. And so there is a difference there, and we'll talk more about that. And then in 2010, I went to Connecticut Public Radio, where I stayed for about 13 years. And I've been here now at WBUR, where I manage our local programs. I manage the people who manage the local programs. That's All Things Considered, Morning Edition, our show Radio Boston, our weekend news shows, and all of our newscasts. So it's a great job. Suddenly, like all reporters, I've ascended to middle management. Who would have thunk it? So what are we going to cover? How do I get sound? What is good sound? And how do I turn good sound into a story? And thanks, by the way, to Justin. I have the ideas. He was able to actually make a Google slide that didn't look as horrific as the ones that I made. Good sound doesn't need to be, getting good sound is not hard. It's not intimidating. You can use your laptop on Zoom. You can use a handheld recorder. You can use your phone. You can use a fancier recorder. Let me just look ahead real quick. I'm going to stop here. I'll just spend a second on this one. Look, if you want to do an interview with someone, there are ways that you can, and they're not with you, there are ways that you can do it that are more complicated than Zoom. But honestly, right now, recording a Zoom interview and ensuring that you get good audio is probably your easiest bet. Unless they're going to have a different kind of setup, you could just use the record my interview session on Zoom and then download the files and work off those files. If you want to get slightly fancier, you can have them record themselves on their phone as a voice memo while you're interviewing them on Zoom. And then they send you that file. That's something that happens all the time. You are dependent on them not banging around their phone, blowing air into their microphone. So it's a bit of a dice roll because you can't also hear. Whereas the benefit on Zoom is you're listening along as you're interviewing them. But there are other, like I said, other ways to record streaming audio off your laptop. For what you're doing, my guess is that Zoom is going to be enough. You can use in person all manner of handheld recorders. You can use a fancier public radio quality reporter, but I have also, in a bind when my batteries died, used my phone. And guess what? Nobody at NPR noticed, or maybe they did and they didn't say anything. And so, you know, being there, just as in any part of journalism, is the part that matters. Getting the sound is what matters. I'd rather you get sound in an imperfect way than avoid getting sound because your conditions aren't perfect. Let's keep going here. So when you're getting sound, let's say you're in the field, you need to be listening along to the best of your ability. You can't really listen along necessarily with a phone. Whatever your microphone is, if it's your phone, if it's an actual microphone, if it would be a phone or a handheld microphone. I wouldn't use a lavalier in this case. You got to get close with your microphone. Your microphone is here. That's where it is. Now, if your microphone is right here, if you put your hands here and you say the word, paprikash or something, and you can feel the air hitting your hand, that's called a plosive, and we'll hear that on the air. You don't want to do that. So you're going to be a little off to the side with your microphone so that the air passes by your microphone, so we don't hear all those, what we would call popping peas. As you're interviewing, always make sure you're recording. Sometimes recorders have like this flashing light that says, I'm ready to record, and people mistake that for recording. Make sure you're recording, because you'll be pretty bummed out if you get to the end of it and you haven't been recording. I often stop and start a lot during an interview. People don't notice it, but I would hit start. I would stop recording and hit start again to create several different files, just in case one of the files were to get corrupted. You don't want like a 2-hour file and then your batteries die at minute 15, at 1 hour and 59 minutes, and then you've lost it all. So that might be just my anxiety and my OCD, coming out, but there it is. Don't interrupt. I'm a chronic interrupter. So, but don't interrupt. Use your face. If you want to agree, show surprise, use your face. Because if you're stepping on your interview, it's going to make it very hard for you to cut up their sound in a way that makes sense. So, have a free-form conversation, sure. Give them a chance to finish a thought, lest they finish saying the most brilliant thing that you've gotten on tape, and you step on the end of it and have to cut it out. Keep if you're using a microphone, don't bang it around in your hands. Know that if your cable is at your hip and it's, banging at your hip, the microphone will pick up that vibration and you won't be able to use it. So just be aware of all these things. Watch your levels. Levels are the readout that it'll go from green to red. I'm sure you're familiar with it. You want to be in the healthy level. If you're seeing a lot of red, tone down your microphone a little bit, turn down your level, your input, so you're not topping out. You top out, it sounds really loud, and you can't, again, it's going to be hard to use. In some cases, it can be cleaned up, but let's not rely on that. Room tone, ambi. This is a strange one that you probably don't know if you've not worked in radio, but if I'm interviewing someone, I'm in this little soundproof booth, right? I need the sound of this booth. There is a sound here. Even though it's soundproof, I need the sound of this booth to run under an interview very often, because it helps soften the transitions. So it doesn't sound like I'm going from Jeff telling a story back into the booth and Jeff telling a story and back into the booth. It helps create a sense of continuity. You always need, in every interview you do, 30 seconds to a minute of just telling the person, hey, this is your moment of relaxation for the day. We're going to sit here quietly and I'm going to record the room. Don't say anything, and I'll let you know when I'm done. And you can use your finger. This means, don't talk. And that's one way of doing it. And if the sound changes, so like if you're interviewing someone in their kitchen and there's a refrigerator, and then halfway through the interview, the refrigerator stops its, running, the motor stops, you need to capture both of those room tones, because it's all going to be essential to pulling your story together in the end. Then the last point, what they're saying versus how they say it. So if they say something really well, if they say something in 30 seconds, but they say essentially the same thing in far fewer words, in a more persuasive way in 10 seconds, that's the clip you want. Because this is the communication business, right? So then there's what is a good sound. You have to get a scene. Think of your anecdotal lead. You have to find an example that helps me illustrate the entire story at the top, and you have to grab your listener. We know that listeners are very finicky and will change the dial really quickly if you're not grabbing them at the outset. So you have to use sound to get there. It's not background noise. It's not like traffic moving by, unless you're doing a story about traffic. It's not a gimmick. Sound is scene, and scene is emotion, it's activity, it's people doing things, and it's things that are representative of the story that you plan on telling. So with your sound, it helps you show and not tell, right? It helps you, we'll come to this later in some things that you can listen to, but done poorly, as I did in one story about winemaking, I didn't capture enough of the scene, and so I had to use my words to describe it. I had to tell a little more than I was able to show with my scene, and that was kind of a bummer. But we were still able to get it on the air. But really, your scene is your sense of place is exceptionally important in radio storytelling. Bring me there, introduce me to humans. If they're from Greater Boston, I want to hear them, right? If they're from New Orleans, where I'm from, you want to hear the difference in the sound. You want to hear people speaking in their voice. If you've ever written a story in a newspaper and you get that quote and you're like, man, this thing is going to fly off the page. It really does, right? It hits you in the gut when you realize how intense that quote is. When you hear someone actually saying it, and this took me a while to learn, it's even more impressive. It leaves even more of an imprint. So I want to hear from people as they're thinking, as their thoughts are evolving, and they don't have to sound brilliant. They have to sound like themselves. And that's the same for you. Writing for broadcast. You are writing for listeners. You are not writing for readers. What does that mean? You keep it simple. You're telling one story. You're not going to be able to make every nuanced point that you might make in a 30-inch story, but newsflash, people probably aren't reading to the bottom of your 30-inch story, and you might not also as a reader do that. And that's as a writer, that's hard. But I have to remember that the people that we're talking to in their cars are driving, they're getting coffee, they're yelling at they got road rage, or I mean they could be distracted. And for us to effectively communicate the important things that we have to communicate to them, we have to keep it simple. And they can't go back, like if they skip something in a newspaper script and they go back up a newspaper story, they go back up to read it again. You don't do that in radio. You don't really get that chance. You get one chance to get them and keep them, and you don't want to lose them. So you got to keep it simple. Think about your audience and not your sources. Just because you talk to them doesn't mean you have to use it. It can inform some of the copy that you write, but it doesn't necessarily have to make it into your story if it's more about serving the fact that you spoke with someone as opposed to serving your listener. Like I said, to the same point, you can't use everything in your notebook. You can't use the bottom of your story as a dumpster. And the tape is rarely longer. The tape of an individual speaking in the context of, say, a 4 or 5 minute story, rarely going to be longer than 20 or 25 seconds. So these are some examples that you can listen to later. The first one is a profile that I did of a family whose middle-aged son lived with schizophrenia and ended up committing suicide. And I use this as an example because there's a lot of talking, but I didn't necessarily create a scene. I'd be curious if you do get a chance to listen to it. Tell me if it worked, what I could have done better. Sometimes you make the best with what you got, right? Here's this winemaking story. I had to write the scene because I didn't get enough active sound. It was a challenge to get active sound, at least at that point when I was there, and I probably should have stayed longer. So you can listen to there. This profile, I have to listen back to. I don't remember exactly who I profiled. I will come back to that. But voicing is important. When you voice a story, just like good column writing, just like any good writing, but especially column writing, don't try too hard. Sound like yourself. Be yourself. You're not going to be Robert Siegel. No one wants you to be Robert Siegel. Robert Siegel doesn't want you to be Robert Siegel. I want you to be you. And I want to be able to pick up the newspaper and know that the column I'm reading is written by a certain person, not because I saw their byline, but because I know their I know their style. And that's the same way with when you voice a story. You're not reading a script, you're telling someone a story. So in here you can hear, differences in voicing if you compared them to one of these earlier stories. You'll get a sense of maybe some of the confidence that I hopefully gained over time. And then the last one is the shameless self-promotion one. We'll click through. When my daughters were little, one of them cut off my older daughter cut off my younger daughter's hair. I interviewed them like a good reporter, made a story out of it, and might just make you laugh if you've never heard it. Kind of went viral 15 years ago, and now my kids are in college and don't like to talk about it. What you can do. You can reach out to me anytime. I got my clock here, Justin. I want to make sure we save time for questions.
Thanks, Jeff. And just a reminder to everybody, the links to the stories Jeff just mentioned, those will be in the video notes. So you'll have those links, you'll have the slides, you can go through all of that material on your own time and really digest it and learn from it. Jeff, question here. You gave a lot of great guidance and tips, but for somebody who's never collected audio ever, are there any good practice exercises or anything that you would suggest somebody could do leaving this presentation here this afternoon, go out, do immediately, just to get a feel for how things work and maybe try some of the suggestions that you provided today?
It's going to be simple. Pick a story. Maybe it's cooking dinner at home. Maybe you're going to tell a short story about the process of making dinner for your family. And practice gathering sound in a low stakes environment. You're going to have to figure out what your story is, but you're going to have to figure that out in whatever you're doing, right? The gathering of the sound, honestly, should be the least frightening thing. I want you focused on your story as you would be in any journalistic environment and less focused on the technical aspects of making the story. I was just talking with someone in the kitchen here at WBUR, and I said I was going to give a presentation on what we're talking about. And he said, just stick the microphone in their face, right? Isn't that what you tell them? I'm like, yeah, you stick the microphone in their face. That would be my answer, Justin.
Fair enough. So you stick the microphone in their face, you start simple, basic, and then you have the audio. When you're going through that audio for the first time, what are some of the things that one might look for to fine tune for the next time? If there's like one or two things that you should look for first on that initial recording.
That's great. Well, what I'll say is process matters. So you want to be really organized when you're cutting up your tape. You might so if you're recording and you've got a 2-hour interview, I don't want you manually transcribing 2 hours. You can use a transcription service. They exist now. They're fairly useful, but you have to always double check yourself when you're going through it. What I want you doing is listening as you're going and putting time records in your notes. So by the time you go sit down, you already know what you're going to pick by and large as the most effective parts of their tape. So you're looking for important things, moving things, insightful things told well. And told well matters. Said well matters. And you really do write around your best tape. One big difference between print writing and radio writing is you get out of the way of your best tape in radio reporting. The less writing I can do, the better. Really, I'm facilitating a conversation of my tape that's going to go on a narrative arc. And the less of my beautiful prose that has to be in there to make that happen, the better.
Got it. So along those lines, I'm getting a number of questions here. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But one question is along the lines of, okay, well, we've got a lot of tape and it's all very powerful stuff. Great recording, great tape. What are some tips that you have as far as going through all of it and determining, because it's all very strong, very powerful, determining what to use and how to cut it down? So this is more, I guess, of an editing question for you.
Yeah. It's really no different than if you're figuring out which quote to use in your print story. You're only going to make typically a point once in a story, right? Your sources, the people you're talking to, you're not going to have the same person saying the same thing over and over again. You got to figure out what exactly is your story, and kill all the other things. no matter you have to be exceptionally judicious. We just put in some story length guidelines that we initiated here at BUR to help our reporters know some benchmark guidelines, because radio is a clock and stories fit or they don't fit. And if they don't fit, we can make them fit, but it's much harder. You have to do the work and be your toughest critic and say, this is the point of my story. This is the information I'm trying to get across. This thing is told really well. It's off topic. Kill it.
All right, so let's get even more specific, because I have one reporter here today. She says, I'm primarily in digital, written and image-oriented news gathering. I love
Yep.
the idea of enhancing stories with straight audio, but what is the ideal length of a clip to capture the voice and thoughts of the person I'm interviewing that doesn't go on too long? Is there an ideal length?
No, it really depends on the thing you're making. Public radio kind of is, these are pretty, our broadcasts are kind of little well-established puzzles, and it can be a little formulaic, unfortunately, at times. If you're talking about sound on the internet, what I would say is, how often are you listening to sound on the internet, on your phone? And in what I would say, approach it not as a maker, but as a listener.
Good
Are
advice.
you going to listen? Are you going to listen to 7 minutes? When are you going to listen to 7 minutes? Where are you when you're listening? Look, shorter in our business, shorter is always better, and I know that it's an attention span problem, but it is it should be no longer than it needs to be excellent. What a terrible answer, but that's the answer.
Fair enough. A couple of technical questions for actually regarding software. The first is transcription. Do you have a favorite transcription app like Otter that can record incoming calls?
Incoming calls. I mean, the one thing you're going to get here is, I haven't been in the field as a reporter in a while. An incoming call on a phone, I think Apple actually does it now. I used to use a thing called Tape-a-Call, I think. But if you get an incoming call and it's a hot source and you just need to get it, I would use one of those. I'm not the most up at the moment on apps on the phones, but I would say, hey, I'm going to send you a text with a link to Zoom. And frankly, it's going to be a cleaner audio, because you're not going to be using the cellular network you're not going to sound like a cell phone. You're going to sound a little more internet-y, but that's what I would say. And people use Descript for transcription. That's what we use internally. You can also use it for an editing. They have ways of editing within it. I personally like editing in Adobe Audition, GarageBand. All these things are very similar. You're just cutting and pasting sound.
And actually, that leads into my next question about editing software. Is there any editing software that you would recommend, particularly inexpensive editing software? And then just as a follow-up to that, for those that want to take everything that you suggested here, are there any other tutorials or resources online that you could direct people to?
So the software, I have used Audition for my entire career. I think maybe I used something else earlier, but I don't even remember what it was. We use Pro Tools in-house. Any cheap sound editing software is going to get you where you need to go. We have not talked a lot about sound editing. Justin, I'd be happy to do a different conversation on that, but it's a fairly technical experience. So I won't go too deep into that, but I'm less concerned about the technical specs. Audition is fine. I'm less concerned about that than about you going out and being a great reporter and getting the best sound you can.
Got it. Well, there we go. I've got an idea for a future 30-minute skills lesson, and Jeff,
there you go.
Tapping you on the shoulder for that one.
Oh, and it's fine. And then in terms of training resources, I think it's npr.org/training. They've got just a huge log of fairly well organized training resources there.
That's great to know. And for everyone, I'll provide a link to that site in addition to the stories that Jeff mentioned. Got one more question here before we wrap up. And again, I know you're not an attorney here, so you can't speak to a lot of the legality in getting recordings, but maybe you could provide us just some best practices as far as getting permission, if in writing, if necessary, from those that we're speaking to, particularly if you're talking to minors. Are there any best practices outside of, I know you're not giving legal advice, but best practices you should know?
I'm not a lawyer, but I can fake one on this webinar, right? Always record it. So leaving minors aside, whenever I'm doing an interview, I make it exceptionally clear that I'm recording now. And I record me saying, so we're clear, I'm recording now, especially on a phone call, because your phone call, it's like, hello, you can't, depending on your two-party consent, one-party consent state, you don't want to start recording until you've told them that you're recording, lest you be in violation of the law. So you start off and you're not recording, you warm them up a little bit, you loosen them up a little bit, you ask them what they had for breakfast, that kind of thing. And then you tell them very clearly, I'm recording now, just so you're clear. And they say, okay. And then you hit the button, and then you can just say, all right, just confirming, I'm recording now. If you wouldn't mind, count to 10, that kind of thing. So that you've got a recording that very clearly establishes the fact that they understand that they're being recorded. And when it comes to minors, that's a more delicate thing that would involve waivers sometimes. It doesn't always. And that's really more about your institutional policy, I would say, on interviewing minors, whether it be for radio or for print. That's an organization by organization thing.
Thank you. I'm actually going to sneak in one more question here.
Let's go.
I've got a producer's joining us today from WHMP, and is mentioning that previously you said that your radio stories can be pretty formulaic.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that and describe
Sure.
in more detail what you meant?
Yeah, I mean, there's an NPR style, and what I would encourage you to do is to find your own style and to push as hard as you can to break out of the norms, while also recognizing that the norms exist because we understand over time what a listener behavior is. So, you know that if you're calling an editor at a national organization, they're going to have a certain expectation of what your story is going to be, and you're going to have to work within that. At a local level, you can have somewhat more flexibility. It depends on your editor. But I would always encourage some experimentation within the form.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're at just about 30 minutes, so we're going to stop there. Jeff, thank you so much for this lesson. Really
Absolutely.
appreciate it. Everyone who joined us today, many thanks. As a reminder, we provide these lessons as a public service to you. So please return the favor. Encourage your colleagues and friends to join us each month. We have a lot to learn from each other, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. On behalf of NEFAC, thank you for all that you do, and we'll see you next month for our next 30-minute skills. Take care, everyone.